Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is a pleasure to see your lovely faces in this lovely place, Vancouver, British Columbia. Hope you are enjoying the conference so far. I'd like to welcome you to the 2012 Wallace Foundation Distinguished Lecture. It is an honor to introduce this year's lecturer by saying a few words about why Dr. Trent was the perfect person to deliver this year's lecture. Dr. Bill Trent received his PhD in sociology from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And he is a professor of education policy, organization, and leadership, as well as sociology, at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Prior to completing his doctorate, Bill was the founding director of the Educational Opportunity Program at the George Washington University and subsequently served as director of Program Open, a trio talent search program in Washington, D.C. From 1995 to 2000, he served as an associate chancellor at Illinois. Bill has held research appointments at the Police Foundation, the Center for Education Policy at Duke University, and the Center for the Social Organization of Schools at Johns Hopkins University. Bill has also been a visiting scholar at the Education Policy Unit at the University of Western Cape in Cape Town, South Africa. Bill's research centers on educational inequality. He has served as a member and chair of the visiting panel on research for educational testing service, a member of the National Research Council, board on testing and assessment, and co-chair of the NRC Committee on Educational Excellence and Testing Equity. Bill received the Research Focus on Blacks in Education Outstanding Scholar Award in 1999. He was elected a Fulbright Scholar, Senior Scholar in 2004, a College Board Scholar for 2003-2004, and was appointed a Spencer Foundation Resident Fellow for 2006-2007. Bill has chaired the AERA Affirmative Action Committee and assisted in the development of the Brown Lecture, co-chaired and subsequently chaired the AERA-IES postdoctoral fellowship program. And Bill has served as a member of the National Academy of Education Committee on Social Science Research Evidence on Racial Diversity in Schools and on the Working Group on Standards, Assessment, and Accountability. He currently serves as a member of the Social Science Research Council's College Learning Assessment Committee. He is the principal investigator of an NSF-funded project examining undergraduate STEM participation for women and undergraduate minority students. I could go on and on and on, but I'd just like to stop and say, is there any wonder? Is there any wonder why Dr. Bill Trent was selected to deliver the 2012 Wallace Foundation Distinguished Lecture? It is indeed my pleasure to welcome to the podium Dr. Bill Trent. Gotta give him a hug. All right.
Thank you so much. I just dropped all the papers.
Oh my God, I'm sorry.
I was so busy listening to see who that was she was talking about that I completely dropped my papers. So please bear with me for just a moment or two while I reassemble myself. I want to personally thank my dear friend and colleague, President Arnitha Ball, for her support of the work I have been committed to over my career. It is an honor that I quite frankly never imagined being considered for, and one that humbles me greatly. For everyone who had some hand in providing me this honor, I thank you. I've often said that if you do what you're passionate about, what you're most passionate about, you'll never work a day in your life. To which my dear friend and colleague, and current interim dean at my university, James Anderson, replies, "Yeah, we've been meaning to talk to you about that." I also take this moment to thank my wife, Mildred, seated here in the front row, whose patience, sacrifice, regard, care, trust, faith, and support created the space and nurturing that enables what I do. If you did not hear the word love in that list, then I have thoroughly misunderstood its foundational elements. I want to start with a little bit of personal history to situate this talk. I'm sure that I've been writing some version of this talk or giving some version of it for well over 40 years now, so I apologize if you've heard it before. I'm a graduate of the segregated schools of Richmond, Virginia. Completed high school in 1962, 2 years before the passage of the '64 Civil Rights Act. Some 5 years before the schools in the city were desegregated in 1967. Some of you know my good friend John Williams, a scholar and long-term member of AERA, and someone many of us call friend and colleague. John and I became childhood friends because he could not go to the neighborhood school just down the street from his house and was transferred to the same elementary school I attended. That was 1954, and we were fourth graders. It is perhaps no coincidence that John and I both have spent our careers working on this social justice issue. As many of you know, Richmond, Virginia is the capital of the Confederacy, and I like to say I was quite proud of it. At the age of 13, then Governor Allman declared, and I quote, "Over my dead body will they desegregate the schools in the state of Virginia." Those early experiences necessarily inform my understanding of the resistance to school desegregation and the problem of resegregation. On the other hand, I'm also one of the first two black graduates from a small Methodist liberal arts college in Appalachia. In that space, I came to understand the power of ignorance bred and nurtured in segregation. It is an ignorance that can be both intensely vicious, mean, and hurtful, while explicitly innocent, given that there has been no opportunity to learn anything different. In that space, I also began to gain insight into the ways in which desegregation creates the opportunity to begin the process of integration. It is from this personal context that I have sought to make the point in my work that desegregation is necessary but far from sufficient, and that desegregation by itself is not an educational treatment. Conflating integration to mean no more than desegregation has been a major policy flaw, and we, social scientists and educators, have not served ourselves well in our inconsistency of use of the terms and in our unwillingness to fully engage in the conceptualization and study of integration. It is instructive that the highly regarded meta-analysis of studies of desegregation by Troop and Pettigrew identifies research on the last of Gordon Allport's 4 conditions to achieve integration among previously segregated groups as the least frequently found explored or for which there was data. Resegregation is in part an outcome of this fundamental flaw in our work. For this lecture, I seek to make this a much clearer issue, and one that can inform our ongoing work in this area. Let's look at the last 158 years of court and legislative responses. This opening slide provides a heuristic device for seeing and sensing the responses to desegregation in education. Beginning with the Roberts case in 1849 and ending with Meredith in 2007 is really a very sobering experience. In Meredith, by severely limiting the use of race in redress, we have made it far more difficult to desegregate American schools, and I argue far more difficult to provide the context for achieving integration. In doing so, it reintroduces and makes possible the reestablishment of the conditions that foster the injustices, constraints, and discriminations that are known to hinder the quality of education and thereby the quality of life chances for many Black and Latino youth. I am not an advocate of desegregation at any and all costs. There's far too much that can be lost in a child's development to an environment that is neither intellectually, socially, or emotionally healthy. Resegregation in American education today is driven by a range of factors, some of which are, relatively speaking, somewhat new. Others are persisting ones that we have yet to overcome in a sustained way. The charter school movement is a new contributor to segregation levels and has been argued to have its kindred roots actually in the Jim Crow era. Think Prince Edward County, Virginia, when they closed the schools for 5 years and when the elected officials were seeking ways to transfer public dollars into their pockets to run private schools, white academies for white children. The use of school choice language, often in concert with charter schools, is not new. And while it may be closely aligned with a broadly held American value, choice, I am reminded that it too has its roots in the opposition to Brown. Southern states especially sought to claim this issue as theirs, this issue of states' rights and choice. Housing segregation is not new and remains a major source of segregation along race and class lines in cities, suburbs, rural areas, and small cities. While Blacks and Latinos have a growing suburban presence, it appears that the residential housing patterns remain largely in place after entering the suburbs. Moreover, housing segregation today is very much a class issue. As a result, we have segregation as limiting both race and class diversity. We also get considerable within-school segregation from tracking and ability grouping, as well as through the biased and disparate use of severe punishments, where African American and Latino males are sometimes twice as represented in those totals as they are as a percentage of the school population. We should hardly be surprised by the resistance to desegregation and the resegregation that we witness. So with that as context, I have a few things I'd like to have you look at. Figure 1 informs us of the change in enrollment distribution in suburban schools from 1993-94 to 2006-2007. Mainly, the white share of suburban enrollment has declined from 72% in 1993-94 to 59% in 06-07. Latino student share nearly doubled in that period, and Black and Asian shares increased also. But this change in distribution did not lead to major changes in minority student concentrations in majority-minority schools. Figures 7 and 8 are illustrative. In Figure 7, each racial category shows a decrease in the white share of enrollment in their schools. Suburban Black and Latino attended schools with the lowest share of white enrollment in both years, 34% and 31% respectively, in 2006-07. Figure 8 shows the racial isolation experienced by suburban students. This graph shows, for each racial category, the percentage of students of their own race in their schools. White students are far more likely to be in school with high proportion of white students, even though the concentration decreased from 93-94 to 06-07. Interestingly, the isolation measured this way increased for Black and Latino students during that same time period. For Blacks, it was a 1% increase, but for Latino students, it increased by 7 percentage points. The takeaway from these tables is that minority concentration in suburban schools is increasing as the racial composition of the suburbs increase. If housing segregation in the suburbs continues to follow historical patterns, then we can expect an increase in racial concentration for all students in same-race schools. For Black and Latino students, this includes being in high minority schools. The exception to this pattern for now is the Asian students who share their schools with higher percentages of whites. In the next tables, I want to explore with you some national trends. Following the work and lead of Gary Orfield and his colleagues at now the West Coast Civil Rights Center, I have used the tables constructed very much as they have, with an emphasis on students in hyper-segregated schools, schools that are 90 to 100% minority. The data from the recently released Common Core data set, including data for 2010, was used for this replication of that work, replication and extension. So we replicated and extended the tables found in Orfield and Lee in 2004. The replication includes using their definition of states comprising each region. In tables 1 and 2, I display the enrollment of Black and Latino students respectively in hyper-segregated minority schools, 90 to 100% minority. I should say tables 1 and 3. I reconstructed those. There are 2 points to make with table 1. First, the 1968 to 1988 drop in concentration in hyper-segregated schools is dramatic. It shows the value of enforcement to reducing racial isolation. Next, using 1988 as the baseline, the increase in concentration is consistent through 2010 for the South and West, but declined in the remaining 3 regions for 2010. Neither the decreases or increases in concentration were substantial. It is striking, however, that Black students' concentrations in hyper-segregated schools has been consistently higher there than in other regions. This is likely attributable to housing segregation in large urban centers, especially northeastern central cities. Table 2 repeats this analysis of concentration, but this time using a wider band. 50% to 100% minority, to define majority-minority schools. Here, the pattern is different. First, the drop from 68 to 88 is not as distinctive as was the case for hyper-segregated schools. It was a big drop for the South, for the border states, but not for the other regions. From 1988 through 2010, there is an increase in the percent of blacks in 50 to 100% minority schools, with the exception of the Midwest in 2010, and the decrease was not substantial. What is striking is that after 42 years, we see clearly how we have returned or nearly returned to 1968 levels of segregation in each of the 5 regions. In the South and Midwest, the gap is about 6 percentage points, and within 3 percentage points in the border states. The pattern for Latino students presented in Table 3 is quite different. In the South, Midwest, and West, the rates of increase in hyper-segregated schools show consistent increases over the 42-year period. The increase in the West and Midwest, the increases in the West and Midwest have been most dramatic. The Northeast looks consistent with some indication it may have peaked in 1991. In the South, Midwest, and West, Latino students show a greater concentration of enrollment in hyper-segregated schools than blacks. The pattern of concentration in 50 to 100% minority schools for Latino students is also quite clear. The 2010 concentration surpassed the 1968 levels in all regions for which there was sufficient data. It is twice as high in the West in 2010 as it was in 1968. Using 1988 as the baseline, then both the South and Northeast show small declines in Latino concentrations in majority-minority schools. Comparing Black and Latino concentrations in majority-minority schools, it seems clear that both are high. Both show nearly 60% enrollment in majority-minority schools in every region. For Blacks, there is no region in which fewer than 68% are enrolled in majority-minority schools. There are majority-minority schools that produce outstanding, high-achieving students. For example, a substantial number of the Gates Millennium Scholarship recipients for the first 6-7 cohorts graduated from majority-minority schools. That said, the evidence regarding the inadequacies that challenge the accomplishment of consistently strong learning outcomes at these majority-minority schools is substantial. That is especially the case for hyper-segregated schools. In an effort to illustrate the patterns of concentration at a more local level, I chose to conduct a similar examination of these patterns for 5 school districts that have had high-profile desegregation litigation cases. The 5 districts: Charlotte Mecklenburg, Kansas City, Prince George's County, St. Louis, and San Francisco. Using Common Core and census data for these districts, I am able to show 2 patterns that contribute to the harmful conditions for learners. First, for each district, I want to show the change in racial composition of the high schools from 1989 to 2009. Next, I'll show the changes in the enrollment percentages of students on free lunch for the same high schools for the same period. This captures an illustration of the conjoint changes that challenge learning outcomes for these districts. Moreover, these are districts with a history of having to comply with court-ordered, court-mandated desegregation. Finally, I chose them because I know a little bit about each of these districts, having been an expert witness in each one. To set the context for student enrollment in each district, I need to show the student demographics, especially the levels of resident school-age population and the level of enrollment in public schools by race for the districts. Tables 5 and 6 present that data for Black, Hispanic, and for whites, respectively. Table 5 shows that resident Black and Latino child population in each district increased in each decade. Even in San Francisco, despite having a relatively small resident population. Each of these districts had and continue to have a different baseline of eligible enrollees. For each show that the Black and Latino enrolling percentages exceed their representation in the resident population. Finally, looking at the resident populations only, we see that Prince George's County, Kansas City, and St. Louis became more Black and Latino in the resident population, which has further increased the proportions in the schools. These districts' Black and Latino populations are oversubscribed relative to their resident populations. Table 6 shows a different pattern for whites, who are a smaller resident share and are always undersubscribed relative to their share of the resident population. It is also clear that whites have been leaving some of these districts at a substantial rate. Now we can turn to the next set of tables that track racial composition concentrations. Table 7 looks at hypersegregation for Blacks. Not surprisingly, PG County and Kansas City show the highest levels of Black concentration in hypersegregated schools. The combination of declining white resident population and whites being undersubscribed is a perfect recipe for these high levels of enrollment in hypersegregated schools. This pattern is made even clearer in Table 8, showing Black student enrollment in majority-minority schools. Look especially at Prince George's County, which says that all of the schools in the county are majority-minority in 2010. Tables 9 and 10 repeat these analyses for Latino students in the same districts. The different districts show clearly different patterns for Latino students, signaling the different demographic characteristics for each district. Here again, the odds of being in a hypersegregated school are highly likely because of the resident population demographics. Tables 11 and 12 further confirm it, because in those places where the population is so distinctly Black and Latino, white students who remain in those districts, who do use the schools, are also attending hyper-segregated schools, majority-minority schools, I should say. So these tables for the 5 districts provide a closer look at the patterns of resegregation and some of the sources of that resegregation. In particular, we can see the effect of limited numbers of whites as contrasted with white underutilization of the schools. At the beginning of the last set of charts and tables, I noted that I have some familiarity with these districts. For example, I know which schools are the traditionally high-performing schools in several of the districts. I also know or have been in those schools to see the student body and staff at work. That helps me understand some patterns of resegregation that appear in these analyses. So I want to show you some graphs that show the trend line for the resegregation for each of the high schools included in these analyses. They are paired with charts that show the increasing enrollment of students eligible for free lunch also. There's just a few examples so that the patterns of school resegregation will become even clearer, showing the increased concentration of students of color and the increased concentration of students eligible for free lunch. So the first graph is for Charlotte Mecklenburg, North Carolina high school racial composition. The story that emerges here is one of interest in that each district that we'll see, there are almost two distinct sets of high schools, differing in their pattern of high racial composition, high poverty, or low minority population and low poverty. The graphs are an informative way of seeing these patterns. It is also instructive to see that the changes in composition don't take place overnight, that there has been an ongoing process for virtually 20 or more years in most of these sites. It is suggested that there are almost two districts operating, one that achieves very high standards of excellence and one that does not. More importantly, they tend to serve different populations. So, let's go through a few of these. That's the Charlotte school percent free lunch. That's Kansas City. No schools in Kansas City in 2010 were below 70% minority. No schools in 2010 were below, I think that's 50% concentration, high poverty. Prince George's County. Prince George's County is now one of the strongest African American middle class communities on the map. The two schools that you see at the lower end at the bottom part of the map, the green line and the blue-gray, are Eleanor Roosevelt High School and Bowie. Both schools serve two of the more affluent communities, and I believe both schools, certainly Eleanor Roosevelt, I believe, is an exam school, which is another topic I'll come back to. Prince George's County, school percent free lunch. That's surprising to people, but the transformation of Prince George's County hasn't all been on the backs of poor people. It is a strong middle-class community. When we went as a team into Prince George's County, it was very clear that the chief elected official in the county was anxious to get some of those homeowners who were going to support the new football stadium for the Washington Redskins that's out in Prince George's County. They were also campaigning trying to get the baseball stadium, but they didn't get that. But the success of that county in terms of its middle-class population is substantial. It is also one of the places where there was a recent Washington Post article that interviewed several black residents of a very high middle-class to upper-class black community. And this is one of the new twists. whereby you have African American communities identifiable by their higher class concentrations that are seeking to be neighbors with each other. That constitutes a different set of dynamics with regard to the patterns that contribute to resegregation. Just get through these. This is San Francisco. Again, you see two distinct pairs or sets of schools, and this is San Francisco's fluctuations in free lunch enrollment. St. Louis, Missouri. One of my doctoral students is a graduate of that red line school, and it is the highest performing school in the district. That's Metro High. There, you see that Metro High is also one of the schools that's least encumbered by high rates of poverty. Okay, why do we care about resegregation in education? There are certain things that resegregation is a threat to, and those are some of our long persistent aspirations. It is a threat to a continuing concern to secure and protect the constitutional and human rights of all citizens. A continuing concern to achieve improved learning outcomes and academic achievement. A continuing concern to secure improved intergroup relations. A continuing concern to secure improved long-term benefits in social mobility, work, and income. And finally, a continuing concern to secure social justice and democracy. In the next few charts, I want to show you the evidence that supports why we are concerned. In San Francisco, segregation confined Black and Latino students to schools with substantially fewer resources than their majority white schools. Note the disparity in AP courses across San Francisco Unified Schools. They map quite well onto the racial composition of the schools. There are no predominantly Black and Latino schools that have anything approaching double figures in AP courses or honors courses. Students in those schools competing for access to the UC system are at a distinct disadvantage. As an expert witness in Gratz v. Bollinger, the admissions formula, which was charged with weighting race too heavily, was actually quite skewed against Black and Latino students. In this slide, you'll notice that over 70% of the African American kids came from high schools in the metropolitan area that had 3 or fewer AP courses. They told me not to look around, but I can't read that chart too well from here. These were students who were in the applicant pool from the greater Detroit metropolitan area, and those schools again offered 3 or fewer AP courses. For Latino students, the totals are plus 60%. In contrast, white and Asian students are not present in those schools in any significant number, but are in much better resource schools and benefited from both from being in a school of higher quality, for which the Michigan admissions formula gave points, and from taking more rigorous regimen of courses. For too many Black and Latino students, that choice was not available. So let's look at the next set of tables. and graphs. For the 2002 high school class from Illinois, the Illinois Research Council examined the distribution and role of teacher quality for students in the 2002 cohort. There is a consensus that easily one of the most valued school resources is a quality teacher. The story that these tables tell is compelling. First, they show that high teacher quality is inversely distributed in relation to school poverty. So the distribution of school teacher quality by school percent poverty. You can see that in the lowest poverty schools, upwards of 50% almost are students who score with a high, teachers who score with a high TQI. Fewer than 2% score in that lowest quartile. By contrast, in the high poverty school, the highest concentration of teachers are all in the lowest quartile. It is also the case that the distribution of TQI is inversely related to school percent minority. You can barely tell the difference between this chart and the chart for high concentrations of low-income students. Teacher quality was also examined in relation to the performance of students in terms of college readiness. What became clear was that even when students took courses that were AP or honors level courses, and they took those courses from lower quality teachers, it did not give them the bump on test scores, nor the level of college preparation, college readiness that you would expect from taking that level of college course. As a consequence, we are able to see clearly how disadvantaged poor and Black and Latino students are, especially from the sample of students in the 2002 class. The evidence regarding that level of concentration reminds us of the fragility of the educational experiences for those students of color. The report indicates that only 12% of African American students in the 2002 class had access to teachers in the highest two quartiles. 12%. We have a difficult time recruiting those students to the University of Illinois. On each of these scores, the effects of resegregation are profound. It denies students a basic building block for their quality of life. It is clear that students may knock the top off of their coursework, test scores within school, and still be unable to compete in today's market for access to the better four-year colleges. Even worse, they may expend a substantial amount of their financial aid resources taking remedial courses and exit a two-year or proprietary college with only their loan debt to show for it. Those are very expensive wages for us to pay as a society for segregated schooling, compounded with high concentrations of high poverty students. I want to address one clear implication of this resegregation. This is a threat to mobility patterns demonstrated in the research on the Perpetuation Hypothesis. In the 1990s, Braddock, Hawkins, Joe Mills Braddock, Marvin Dawkins, and myself, published research on the Perpetuation Hypothesis, drawing data from 4 different national data sets. Our findings were consistent across all 4 data sets. Desegregated schooling experiences perpetuated themselves across levels of schooling and across context. So in college, the workplace, and in living in more diverse neighborhoods. That work was recently updated by Elizabeth Stern in a 2010 article. Findings suggest that exposure to other racial groups in high school for African American and white students reduces their racial, Our findings were consistent across all 4 data sets. Desegregated experiences led to further desegregated schooling in college, the workplace, and in living in more diverse neighborhood. The study that Stern used actually improved on the measurement techniques and the analytical framework that was used in order to replicate our study, and the finding was that this work was in fact continuing to show a pattern of perpetuation. Why then do we continue to see the ways in which resegregation is threatening to reset barriers that were being slowly weakened? A social philosopher, Elizabeth Anderson, reminds us of the distinction between integration and desegregation. She suggests that integration may be contrasted with 3 other ideas: desegregation itself, color blindness, and assimilation. Desegregation, she says, is the abolishing of the legal barriers to intergroup contact. Colorblindness consists in the abolition of racial identities, not something anyone prefers. And assimilation takes a dominant social group as fixed. She finds each of those 3 alternatives to integration lacking in specific ways. I too find them lacking. And I find our inability to focus on the distinctions to be costly and damaging to our long-term efforts to supply and provide quality educational experience for the most needy in our population. Conflating integration to mean no more than desegregation invites the assumption that much of the benefits of school desegregation is lodged in just sharing the same space. No attention to the quality of the contact. It is about peer interactions and associations, and therefore the burden is to demonstrate positive outcomes from student composition indicators at the school and classroom level in order to substantiate the use of race in school and classroom assignments. That notion invites the undesirable notion of lateral transfer, where presumably sharing the same classroom with whites provides a source of academic and intellectual growth and modeling that somehow translates into Black and Latino children's improved experience and performance. Conflating integration to mean no more than desegregation also relaxes all 4 of the requirements set forth by Gordon Allport that would require assessing the status parity of the students in the school and the support of the adult and/or legal authorities in that situation. In effect, we need not measure integration but rather assume its existence based on the presence of some racial mix in the school. That approach has the consequence of not differentiating between school climates, school cultures, level of inclusiveness, or level of teacher efficacy. As a consequence, we know very little about the extent to which any schools are in fact integrated. A third problem, the benefits of diversity are contingent on the quality of integration. Let me give you two examples. In a study using status attainment approaches, Alexander Kirchhoff used an explanation and a theory that challenged the traditional notions of socialization and employed a theory of allocation. He argued that there are adult authorities that operate and exercise unusual control in ways that consciously and sometimes unconsciously have the effect of substantially changing the nature of the educational experience and outcomes for the students in a school. Counselors, teachers, administrators, and their decisions regarding the placement of students, the punishment of students, are all examples of allocation. We also see allocation at work when we look at the role of school boards, school systems, when they make choices and decisions about where to place academic programs, where to place high-quality teachers, what the distribution needs to be or should be. We see the impact that that has on the quality of learning opportunity for each of the students who are affected by those adult decisions. One key aspect of those decisions in an allocation framework as employed by Kirchhoff is that it happens without the informed input of the students who are most likely and most often impacted by those decisions. Parents are not consulted, or parents are not fully informed about the services available to their students or not likely to be available to their students. And the outcomes become more clear as we see the rates of failure and the rates of low performance. Having developed this theoretical explanation, Alexander Kirchhoff and Dick Campbell actually provided a study that tested the theory. Using status attainment approach, they modeled educational outcomes for black and white students who were high school students, looking at the prediction of GPAs. They modified the model for black students and white students, including the variable school discipline, counting the number of disciplinary encounters that the students had. In doing so, for the first time in the use of those status attainment models, the models were equally efficient in explaining the black students' outcomes as they were in explaining the white students' outcomes. What was instructive about the use of the school discipline variable is very much what we see now in the disparate school discipline data that's emerging that shows those disparities. That measure was statistically significant and negatively impacted black students' school outcomes, educational outcomes. For whites, it was not statistically significant and had negligible, if any, effects. That provides the kind of evidence to suggest the extent to which those practices in school that have the effect of changing and altering the educational experiences of the students without the input of the family, without the knowing or informed knowledge or consent, provides adequate example, I think, of the importance of understanding an allocation set of practices in addition to our traditional focus on socialization. A second example that I think implicates the role of adults in influencing what we think of as peer effects. The article by Janet Hunt, Assimilation versus Marginality, is a piece that I often refer to and use. It's a study of black and white students in both segregated and desegregated school context for the black students. These were junior high school students, and the students were asked a critical question, a criterion question among each group, and that was, did they depend on their school for a sense of belonging? Did they depend on their school for a sense of belonging? The findings from that work were counterintuitive. Black students who attended desegregated schools, who expressed no dependence on their desegregated school for a sense of belonging, had the highest efficacy scores and performed academically most like their white peers. By contrast, black students in desegregated schools who chose or who expressed dependence on the school for a sense of self performed least well and actually performed less well than their black counterparts in segregated all-black schools. What's instructive about that and that generated the title was the question of what is the right choice for a student of color in such context? To choose, to expect, and desire an expression of inclusion from the schools, from the staff, from the peers, or is it a safer adaptation to choose not to rely on that context for a sense of self or a sense of belonging? Both studies implicate the extent to which we have been effective in integrating our school context. They demonstrate, I think, that desegregation is necessary but not sufficient. We can get, as Troop and Pettigrew report, a reduction in prejudice, some reduction in discriminatory behavior. But in order to have some opportunity to have some learning benefits occur in classrooms where different racial compositions occur, we will have to do more. To do more, we would have to develop what Isaac and Benjamin refer to and call a culturally competent service system or set of institutions. A fourth problem, the learning and social benefits, short-term and long-term, that can be derived from the use of race to desegregate school in order to construct a diverse learning environment are actually contingent upon implementing the components of an integrated environment, not simply desegregating the school. I would argue that we have failed to do so at all levels of education, pre-K through the PhD. In effect, although we can derive familiarity and likability from increased contact, those are limited horizons in terms of the goals that we aspire to. And it results from our inability and or unwillingness to fully engage the effort that's required to pursue an integrated education and/or work context. An integrated context is one that we work at continuously. There is no there. We are continuously working to sustain, maintain, and improve the quality of the experiences of the members of that context, that setting. It requires not that we are satisfied with simply counting the diversity, counting the numbers, and reporting how diverse we are in those terms, but finding a way to model the behaviors that show the quality and kind of respect that a desegregated context can create the potential for, but not actually deliver. What I found instructive after going through these examples was the interesting parallel between a 1935 statement from W.B. Du Bois and the components of Gordon Allport's conditions necessary for successfully integrating groups of people who have been previously separated. What Du Bois says is that the proper education of any people includes sympathetic touch between teacher and pupil, knowledge on the part of the teacher, not simply of the individual taught, but of his surroundings and background. I recommend you read Arnitha's award-winning article based on her work in South Africa, encouraging the teachers to learn and study from the communities they worked in so that they would develop this understanding of the students they taught, of his surroundings and background, and the history of his class and group. Such contact between pupils and between teacher and pupil on the basis of perfect social equality, a central tenet of Allport's 4 conditions, as will increase this sympathy and knowledge. Facilities for education and equipment and housing, and the promotion of such extracurricular activities as will tend to induct the child into life. Like Allport, Du Bois' instruction to us is an instruction to engage the child as a responsible, caring, and committed to the child's learning adult. To cultivate in your own operations and efforts to teach, to learn how to listen to the diverse students in our classrooms, to learn and be willing to understand more deeply the kind of context from which the child emerges, and to understand the challenges that those contexts, the challenges and the opportunities that those contexts will in fact provide you with in order to be more effective with that child in the classroom. I was struck by the parallels and the extent to which, writing in 1935, perhaps and probably as a good sociologist, not a psychologist, that he so thoroughly paralleled the instructions that we get from the work of Gordon Allport. I would argue that we have been unwilling to engage the effort to do the hard work of pursuing integration. We have been unwilling, in part because there are those who have assumed that it really did mean assimilation, and they were unwilling to give up any aspect of their culture, any willingness to assume the habits, customs, manners, ways of the dominant culture from whom they had experienced considerable oppression. I would also argue that we have been unwilling to do it because there are those of us who favor the ideal of colorblindness, to somehow erase all of the cultural differences, to subsume them. Pursuing either colorblindness or assimilation leaves all of the racial hierarchy in place. It dismantles none of it. Only integration has at its core the pursuit of the dismantling of the racial hierarchy and the reconstruction of a set of relationships that are fundamentally different. Our failure and continuing failure to do so has allowed the kind of resegregation that we see to persist. It is, from the beginning, I think, disabled effective professional development policies that would enable teachers working in diverse classrooms to do a much better job, to have much better training and preparation for being able to work in those diverse classrooms. Those of us who worked with school desegregation from the early years have often been puzzled by the absence of effort or low levels of effort provided to train and prepare the receiving teachers for students that they had little fundamental knowledge of and little fundamental concern and commitment to teach. We will not be able to expect teachers of color to close that gap. My recent examination of degree patterns shows that African American students graduating from college receive fewer than 19% of their degrees in education. That is further encumbered by the low rates of passing on the certification test. Those policies and practices are going to reduce, for some time, the presence of black teachers in classrooms. We need to address that issue, both in the African American community and for Latino teachers and Latina educators. But in both instances, we're looking at a teacher workforce that is likely to be high proportion of majority for quite some time. That will require us to redouble our efforts to think about how we will prepare the next generation of teachers and the current generation of teachers to enable them to better engage this process of taking advantage of the opportunity of desegregation to pursue an integrated work environment. It will not be easy. Meredith has created a set of circumstances that severely limits and constrains what our abilities are in terms of school racial assignment. The courts that we have been pursuing a pattern of eliminating the effective use of race in school assignment and in other ways, whether it's for admissions in college, whether it's for targeting financial aid. We're constrained in all those ways. The reason why the Gates Millennium Scholarship Program does not affiliate with it, operate through any college or university is because it is a racially targeted program. There's no space for that in our current set of policies and practices. Nonetheless, we have to figure out a way to create safer, healthier, and better learning spaces for our children. I would submit that one of our challenges has always been, in part, there are too few of us who know or have a sense of what that looks like. There are not a lot of us who have had the opportunity to live and work in a space that provided that kind of instruction so that we could point to it and model it and replicate it in other spaces. Our efforts to correct this, to challenge it, will have to be an effort that appreciates the politics of education. And we will have to pursue it through those kinds of channels as much as the opposition does. The cases that have been brought, Gratz-Gruder, the upcoming Fisher case, those were not accidentally brought. Those are the result of deliberate and intentional efforts to find a way to unpackage the efforts and successes that we were having in creating a more just society. I think it requires us to do very much the same thing if we are, in fact, going to attend to W.B. Du Bois's instruction about how to develop a proper education for any people. Thank you. If anybody has any. I'm willing to try. If you have questions, be happy to respond. Linda? It's not, well, no. What we see in many cities is the underutilization of the existing schools. So they are, in fact, going to private schools, going to independent schools, going to parochial schools. So they're not showing up in the public schools at all. Those parents who can exercise that option. But as you could see in some of those sites, poor whites who remain in the cities are having to use the existing schools that are overwhelmingly, in many instances, majority-minority schools. The question is, how long do we leave those majority-minority schools as vulnerable as they are in terms of their resource access, whether that's quality teachers, facilities, equipment, administrative leadership? I think all of those are aspects of what we're looking at as an educational infrastructure. One point that I want to emphasize here that's a concern for me with the growth of charter schools. I don't understand charter schools to have a viable social contract with the citizens. Public entities, our governments, have a social contract with us. It is a contract that is embedded in that set of constitutional commitments at the state level, at the federal level. Corporations don't have a commitment to a social contract for us. We have to compel TV stations to do public service announcements. Who owns our children's schools? If we pursue charter schools at the rate we're going, why should they express any support in assisting us in developing the kind of quality, integrated educational environment that I speak of? A market-driven motive that enables diversity, that's consistent with their interest. But I don't think that there is a commitment to a social contract that we can call upon and depend on and expect to be there and to reestablish with our students and with our diverse communities. I think that's something we need to give serious consideration to. Other questions? Yes. I think a number of schools have, in fact, been pursuing an increase in their white male population as the gender balance scales have moved. When they do that, I think they are focusing on race. But I have not seen the legal challenge to doing that. And I think you raise an excellent example. It's peculiar and interesting that in so much of our discourse, if it's an article about white males, it is somehow not a gender article or somehow not a race article. So we seem to have fallen into a habit of exemption on that score. I think it should be addressed. The other issue there is the extent to which organizations and institutions that do not receive public dollars have more freedom to construct their admissions practices. So not participating in certain federal programs, that's the cost of it. So if that allows you more flexibility. And I understand. So yes, I suspect if it's a post-secondary institution, it does. But I do think that's where there's some slippage, some leeway, because there are a number of hospitals that at one point, because they would refuse federal dollars for certain kinds of subsidies and programs, they also didn't have to comply with certain reporting policies and practice and procedures. I think that falls into that same area. Yes? Yes. Yeah, we have an incredible amount of complexity. That complexity has frightened me away from talking about this openly because of, for example, when you look at the history of school desegregation, the way in which many places were desegregated was to fire all of the black teachers. So there's a tremendous amount of pain in the African American community, those of us who think back to those times. And there are horror stories of principals being offered jobs as coaches. I'll give you one personal example. I did my actual practice teaching at a school in Middlebury, Kentucky. And the school had closed the Roosevelt or Rosenbaum School, which was an all-black school. They offered a senior librarian the opportunity to be the librarian at the school if she would return to get her master's degree. She was 1 year from retirement. The master's degree was going to be a 2-year program. It was cynical. The principal of the school was offered a job as either an assistant coach or head coach, but it was a coaching position. And this same school invited me to join their faculty. I politely declined the opportunity to do that because you could drive through Kentucky in those days, this is 1965, 66, and you could see all of the examples of the black schools that were closed because they were separate and clearly not equal. So there is this residue of pain and loss and a strong remembrance of it. Public sector employment has been critical to the black middle class. So when the government has a rift in Washington, in Chicago, the black middle class takes a hit. And when those black schools closed, there was a tremendous hit on the fabric of African American communities. And that hasn't all been forgotten. So to commit to the kind of political strategies that might be workable if you can develop that kind of unity is still a challenge. The tough part about overcoming this has to do with the network of organizations that we think of as elite schools. There was a PBS announcement about 2 weeks ago where a couple who had just confirmed that they were going to be given birth in 6 months had made a $24,000 down payment on a $24,000 a year preschool for their child, 4 years away from entry. This is New York. The school also required that they do some sort of amniocentesis analysis to which they were going to subject it to genetic analysis to get the prediction of the probable intellectual capability of the child. They interviewed the parents, and the mother was quoted as saying, "Of course we're going to do it. This is setting my child on the course for Brown, Harvard, all of those schools that are going to make his life a good life." Now, as incredible as that sounds, there is very much a reality to this set of organizations that we call schools that are interconnected. How they're interconnected is discoverable. And I don't mean that it's anything covert. It's just that we don't spend a significant amount of time thinking about it. When Joe Mills and I talk about the contact hypothesis as a part of perpetuation theory, we always remind ourselves that there are two possibilities. It's not just accessing the network, the broader, richer social network. But for all of you who remember the elementary statistics issue of when you change the proportion of models in the jar, when you increase the number red, black, and blue, the probability of picking a red increases depending on the number of reds in the jar. So one of the benefits, or a partial explanation for the benefits that accrue from being in a desegregated context, even if you're in it but not of it, is that that's where Quaker Oats recruits. That's where NASA recruits. The 63 amicus briefs that were submitted on behalf of the University of Michigan in the Gratz and Grutter cases came from companies that wanted to be able to continue to recruit at a University of Michigan that provided a diverse educational learning context for the students, for both the white students and the students of color. The U.S. Army did it, Schwarzkopf, Shell Oil, General Motors, every one of those filed on behalf, an amicus brief on behalf of the University of Michigan. That's instructive in terms of who recognizes the importance and viability of a University of Michigan providing that kind of educational experience and that kind of diverse learning context. I do think we have to appreciate that that's very difficult for North Carolina A&T to compete with, or for Xavier. Xavier produces outstanding students in dentistry and pre-med, but they're only tangentially connected to that larger mobility network. So the desegregation that we're failing to sustain is costly with respect to the shape of the river. The way we enable students of color and women to have a place in those contexts is by creating the kind of experience in elementary and secondary school that enables them to become more knowledgeable about that set of experiences, and therefore to be better able to navigate in those environments. That's an expensive cost. The Gates Foundation makes explicit, if you go to the GMS website, one of their goals is to train future leaders from among those scholarship recipients. They're very intentional about trying to get as many of those scholarship recipients into the most selective institutions they can get into. That was an explicit goal, a great deal of intentionality. And the reason for that is in order to be able to have those young people who are talented but grew up perhaps with limited resources be able to someday be in the midst of those management teams, be in the midst of those CEO and executive teams, and begin to change the nature of how those spaces not just look, but how they work and what they focus on. So I think we can't ignore that aspect of this process of desegregation, because if we resegregate, we will further limit and restrict access to those pathways to some of the more elite kinds of positions. And that's a costly venture, given what we have invested. A part of the reason why I put that first slide up is because we've been in a 159-year process since 1849 in an effort to try to do it. I don't know if anybody saw it, but some were green, some were red. The red ones were not good decisions for communities of color. And that was intentional because I wanted us to have a full appreciation for how much opposition there is and how long that opposition has been there. It has been long, it has been consistent, and we see every sign that it will continue to be. We have to be as diligent in trying to produce more of those green tags. Yes.
I think this will be our last question.
Okay.
There are more sectors of government than education that impact this. Whether or not mayoral control opens up more multifaceted liability or opportunity for extending desegregation.
It's a tough one. Most explanations of mayoral control seem to center on mayors wanting to have better control of the total sets of budgets and contracts that they get to influence and exercise control over. Those are probably more cynical views of it. Because you would want to ask yourself, why would a mayor want to be in charge of the Chicago Public Schools? That's a huge thing to think about being in charge of, especially with the history of challenges with it. Or any school district for that matter. You take Kansas City, Charlotte, Mecklenburg, all of those are problematic in some sense. So we have to look at all of the possible reasons for it. I don't know that, I'm not sure what the desegregation incentive would be to a mayor, unless that mayor has a highly diverse city. If that's the case, then they have a more than adequate reason to want to build that kind of insistence into the schools. They would also have the concern for wanting to be able to prevent some of the long-term cost. It's expensive having the percentage of dropouts and students who fail to complete school that we have in many of our urban areas. And again, I submit that those failure rates are a reflection of what we're not doing to engage students with a sympathetic touch and an understanding way. But it's incredibly costly to have the levels of failure and incompletion that we actually have today. But I don't have a better answer for you for why the mayors would want to take control and actually build a stronger strategy about desegregation, unless they can translate it into a quality question. If that becomes a way of explaining and justifying those kinds of commitments, perhaps we can see that happen. Thank you.
I'd like for us to thank Dr. Trent one more time for sharing his knowledge, his expertise, and for delivering our Wallace lecture today. You may continue conversations on a one-on-one basis. Thank you, and have a good conference.